Usually when we talk about, oh, there'll be an episode on this topic in the future, it's something that will actually come up in 7 to 10 episodes in the future that we have scripted or that we have at the very least an outline of the kinds of topics we want to explore or like a calendar list of like read this book by this point so we can have the research ready. But in the other episode on Hagstones, when you, Key, said we should do an episode on the Shrat, I didn't know it was going to be the next one. Like,
Yeah,
bro.
I was thinking about shot, was thinking about all the different things that they could be. So I just started writing down notes about what they were, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is an episode. So
Yeah, I mean, episode 8 was supposed to be something entirely different, but I'm glad it's the Shrat, and I'm glad that, you're the Schratmann.
I'm the scat
mhm.
Because these guys can be anything, it turns out, and I love that versatility. It's kind of like our friend Nay Nordman, who writes a lot about gnomes and Frisian and Dutch folklore, and how diverse the word gnome can be, and kabouters and so on. It just seems like this is one of those terms that can apply to so many broad categories of folklore. And I think, having even looked over a bit of the research that you've done, but certainly not all of it, I'm super excited to hear you talk about this, Key, because you are remarkably well versed in the Dutch and Germanic stuff, and I'm super hyped to hear you tell us all about the world of Schat.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah, that's Nate Nordman. Check her out on Instagram, House of Nomi. That's Gnomi. For all, the OG gnome crone herself, who hopefully will, we've been chatting about having her on for an episode, and that's definitely going to happen in the future. But yeah, there we have it. I think we should just head into this one because oh yeah, I think it's worth mentioning I'm back. You can probably tell by the sound quality of my mic. I am no longer traveling, banished to the far reaches of the United States. I'm back in my home with Salt, whom I've missed dearly. So and a home that will be yours soon. So I'm very excited for everything to be kind of back at its place. And I think we did a good job getting a few episodes out still on schedule, given
Yeah.
that we were all in different places. I mean, you even were in like reservations at one point and doing all kinds of things for your job. So it was definitely, I think one of our Q&As had the most scuffed audio from your end of all time, but we got it done. Thank you so much to our Patreons and everyone for sticking by with us. And we're really excited for all the amazing new episodes we have arranged.
And talking of everyone being home, like it's quite a topical episode, right? To follow everyone getting back to their houses and stuff.
Hang up your chicken gods because we got a bunch of chicken related house spirit activity to come through as well.
That we do. We're going all over the place. This is a bit of a recap for the last two episodes if anyone is new and listening for the first time. So yeah, let's get right into it.
Let's go. Be not alarmed at the frightful howls which you may hear. It's Svinga, Salt, Bushgrusmutaki.
Hey.
Which is what the bush grandmother?
Yeah, literally the grandmother of the bushes or bush grandmother, yeah.
Yeah, like so Kia and I speak German. We might have mentioned this a few times, and it's one of the languages we practice together a lot. Neither of us are, 100% fluent, but certainly we're up there. Our pronunciation, it does its thing of going up and down at times, because my native language is an Eastern European one and his native language is English, so it's one of those things of like finding the middle ground of some pronunciations isn't always there. But I saw this as like the bee of the day, and I was just like, Bushgrossmutter. Like I knew you were a daddy. I didn't know you were a mommy.
Yeah, the
Is that a new thing the gentlemen call you, sir?
uh, we're transgenerationally dominating out here, daddy,
Okay.
mommy, grandmommy. I don't know. We're off the rails already. You know,
It's a dry break episode all over again. Oh God.
he comes back to haunt us every time.
He
But yeah,
does. He does, but
yeah, and some fun, thing we'll get into later. Bush Großmutter, she's hanging out. She's in a lot of folkloric accounts. The Bushmutter, they're just like, we don't talk about her.
Mhm.
Also,
All right.
on the pronunciation, learned a lot of German from native Vietnamese speakers. Very long story, but some weird. That's where some weird accent stuff might slip in. So if anyone, Viet German diaspora, shout out to you guys.
Yeah.
So to get into some of the things that we brought up in the last 2 episodes, we begin with the Schrat, who we brought up in the Germanic part of the, I almost said chicken god, Hagstone episode.
It is the
Symbiote.
chicken god episode. I listen. Do you know how many DMs I got on my Instagram, which seems to be the many people talk to me about our podcast, because I didn't make like a podcast Instagram. I was like, well, I'm going to use my own Instagram, and that worked out well so far. But like, people do DM me about the episodes, and quite a few people were like, "Oh, chicken god, I love that. Like, I'm going to start using that as my Hagstone name. Like, no one will know." But as you pointed out last episode, which I didn't even know, despite being a bit of a nerd for German folklore myself, is that you have the very same term in German adopted from Slavic speaking countries. So chicken god is going to keep coming back. Like, we all love hagstones. We love a whole stone, as we talked about, and a forked stick. But this I think our chicken patrons will continue to endure as we talk about Schratmann house spirits and the Geodmenschen and the Mandrake and everything. But anyway, let me not get ahead of myself. Take it away.
All right, so to speak of hold stones and forked sticks, in the household spirit umbrella, kind of breaking it down into 3 broad tongue-in-cheek categories, which are things that look, act, or behave like dwarfs. So the kobold, of course, of German mythology, the gnomes, the klabauter, and things of this nature. Things that look like sticks. So we're going to go up into the Baltics, specifically with Estonian accounts, and then back down to Germany to talk about the mandrake, or Alraun, as you just mentioned. And things that look like snakes, saving the best for last, probably, in your opinion, Snika.
Listen, I will not deny that I'm a snake girly through and through.
Oh, yeah. All right, so things that look like dwarfs. In the beautiful blur of the never-ending headaches caused by oral lore, especially in translation, there are an incredible array of names that can be used, and I'll try to stick to Schrat, dwarf, or the German loan into English at this point, kobold, when appropriate going forward. But there are highly regional variations, and a lot of nuance can be lost in this translation. One that I really want to highlight is Heimchen. So in German, this means the little house, cutely enough, which lends its name to a ton of different things, notably the house cricket, which we will come back to, incredibly important. Various different species of dwarfs, gnomes, or mountain-dwelling, earth-aligned spirits, or mannequins, or similarly gained familiars that are seated into the roots of plants or stones themselves.
Sounds like a pretty Pinocchio pilled term right there.
A little bit. Hopefully we aren't, out here telling lies and things to cause his nose to grow, because as we will find, that is a way to actually banish these spirits. So but we'll get to that. So the Schrat, in the office of the domestic dwarf or kobold or familiar in this way, will enter into the homes of good and virtuous people at night, specifically at night because they dislike being seen or interacted with, as is common across European folklore of house spirits, to help with household tasks, most commonly in the kitchen or around the farm, such as, in the barn, in the threshing floor, in the stables, in these traditional, like, medieval and early modern European households. So this is the broadest similarity among them, and now it just kind of goes off the rails and varies village to village, household to household, because in, of course, the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, it was a very common idea that every single household had one of or more of these spirits, sometimes up to 24, which is very fun. And specific sizes are given for the account that has 24 of them, which is very fun to me, in that they could fit in a traditional oven.
Oh, like all of them together?
Yes, all 24 of them.
Oh, okay.
And one of the most interesting things about the account of all of them fitting into that oven is the reason they're in there in the first place is because that is their home in which they will do a ring dance and then thresh grain. So
Oh.
the threshing floor is
Oh.
the oven floor,
Hmm.
which, of course, if you're witchy about it, gets very fun very fast.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even just looking, my mind always goes to the book and stuff, but just thinking about the threshing floor and the oven and the replacement of the oven as the hearth, if you don't have a hearth, in the traditional home, or then the link to like what or each I guess you could call it section of a house or major cultic site, including the pit where the fire is put in for the cauldron, the hearth, the oven, the bed. These all have organs assigned to them for us, as well as saints that will divide themselves amongst which saint claims which window, which saint claims which room, and which animals are buried under which threshold if you're in a very witchy house. And I find it interesting that the relationship between hearth and oven is sometimes interchangeable, sometimes not. And either way, certain house spirits will live in each. The Zmiechu Warkucha, the house serpent spirit, the serpent, very much like the Draka, which we'll talk about in the future of this episode, is the one that lives inside the hearth, because there's a riddle that you say in Serbian, which is essentially where is the dragon's nest, and the answer is the hearth, because that's where your Jasmia lives.
Very, very cool. Yeah, as we'll see, there's a lot of parallels here with the Germanic stuff, like you mentioned, and where we continue to see it as a import from Eastern European folklore, like with the chicken god itself. And we will indeed be talking about chickens and dragon chickens today, which smiling happily.
And also, I think it's worth flagging before you continue. We don't always know. For some of these cases, we do know that, okay, it came from this place, it reached this other place and became translated. But multiple cultures can come up with the exact same kinds of spirits themselves without necessarily interacting. Like, certainly there's a lot of interactions between Germany and Eastern Europe. That's geographically, it's very close by. It's just more to say, it doesn't mean like, oh, these things originate from other traditions. It's more just no more than, when you see the same link in Estonia as we have, let's say, in Montenegro, for the house serpent spirits. It doesn't mean that these things are like not necessarily derived from each other, but it can be spontaneously discovered as the spirits that exist in these landscapes. But definitely, I do love some of the linguistic similarities that you can see, the mutual influence, as well as some of the folkloric things of being like, oh, it's so cool. Like, it seems that people in alpine mountainous regions are going to come up with a lot of the same folklore, whether it's Finnish, Hungarian, Balkan, Pyrenees, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's kind of insane. I mean, even possession, for example, in northern China uses a lot of the same like horse metaphors as you might find in the Caribbean, for example. It's just crazy how like these themes just kind of pop up over and over again. It's definitely clear that spirits.
But the observation of it makes sense, right? Because someone actually getting ridden by a spirit or getting mounted by a spirit, it makes sense to describe it as a horse, because you can see the spirit riding on the person like you would an animal that is being tamed or being used for locomotion. So it's one of those things where like some things are just going to spontaneously happen in the same cultures, even if they don't have contact, because they're going to observe similar phenomena with spirits.
Exactly. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, getting into these descriptions of like these house spirits, I'll bring up a lot more things where it's like, okay, we see this in this culture, this culture, this culture, this culture. We even see them as far afield. As Salt just mentioned, some places in China where certain spirits that we'll talk about later are revered in extremely similar ways, especially, the house cricket. Once we start getting into that, there are, evidence of that independently arising there, which, very cool. So to not get ahead of ourselves, the And to go back to interacting with these domestic dwarfs, despite them not wanting to be interacted with, they are incredibly important spirits to the health and well-being and normal day-to-day function of these households. And they will expect offerings in thanks for the help, especially in the form of food, typically the leftovers of whatever the family made that day, or a millet porridge that is specifically made as an offering to the spirits, often left, in the rafters of the barn or outside the back door or something along these lines. So the thing about this is you have to be kind of tricky and careful because gifts of any kind other than these expected food offerings will almost universally drive them away. In the German and Alpine regions that we're talking about today, there is a notable exception that is a small pair of shoes, often red in color, left near wherever the spirit is living, be it in the hearth, be it in the oven, be it in the barn, be it in the stables, as a thanks for the help. And, going back to this discovery of witchcraft phenomenon that we've kind of invoked, this is documented best in an edict that forbids the practice that was issued by 15th century German clergy. One of the reasons that arises in this region that you don't want to give this offering is because to these spirits, they will interpret payment as their job being finished in totality, and their services will no longer at that point be needed. There's a very fun permutation on this in explicitly Jewish folklore, specifically among Yiddish speaking people in kind of Alsace-Lorraine, more on like the Alsace side in Germany, where there exists a very similar figure that is known as the Schretele, which of course comes from Schrat, the direct loan into Yiddish. So identically to the case of the Schrat, the dwarf will cease to work if given gifts, but the reason is a little different, which is that if given nice clothes, he will be like, I have clothes that are so nice now that I no longer need to work and just be done. Which
I know what I need.
Mhm.
I just need a good shirt on my back, a nice pair of trousers, and I'm good to go.
Man's got an early retirement. Can't blame him, man.
Yeah, definitely not. So, of this Schretele, there's a really famous account that's recorded in Beatrice Silverman Weinreich and Leonard Wolf's book Yiddish Folktales. Really recommend the read; it's very cool. In which a family who is keeping a Schretele specifically in their kitchen at the chimney sees this tiny little hand reaching out from the chimney, gesturing for food. And so they offer him some cracklings out of the frying pan from whatever they cook for dinner, then go back to pouring the fat from the pan into containers for later reuse. So as they're doing this, the fat is flowing from the pan for hours on end, thanks to the blessing of the Schretele in thanks for the food, ceasing only when a shocked family member walks in on the scene of like every container, every jar, every tub in the house in the kitchen full of like cooking fat and utters a string of profanities about how many containers they've used and how are they going to store all this, how are they going to clean all this, which actually unintentionally banishes the Schretele. Because one of the very common motifs, as we mentioned earlier, for the Schrat, the Schretele, the house dwarf or gnome of this kind, is that you should not swear in front of them. It will drive them away. Also, we see the common motif that any container from which they've eaten or drank will not run empty as long as this taboo is maintained. So, on to the next tongue-in-cheek category that we described, sticks. And this comes from the depiction of them, of course, from the film that I think I've unintentionally mentioned 3 times now in this podcast, 2017 movie November, which we got to do a watch at this point.
Please watch it, and yes, we will do an episode on it at some point. Maybe not as quickly as the Schrat episode that's upcoming, but it is a masterpiece. Please do watch it.
Definitely. So, in its most highly preserved form, which comes from Estonian folklore, we see the Krat, of course, being related to the Schrat. And this is, not just a linguistic leap. There is actual, anthropological evidence that shows the flow back and forth between Germany and Estonia with this type of spirit. This is a automata-like being that is made of hay, sticks, barnyard implements, household tools that are ensouled by the devil in exchange for what is usually said to be 3 drops of blood into his black book. The spirit would then serve as a familiar to its master, especially employed in the theft of wealth, goods, or treasure from others. And of course, this is what we'll see again with these spirits as we get more into the figure of the drak and the stealing of goods from others. So one of the things that we also see with kind of the Shretala and the Schratmann, it's dwarven guys and their need to not be paid other than food, is the constant need to be working, lest this figure takes a bit of a more malefic turn in the Krat permutation, where it can turn on its master and actually assault them. There's a really funny scene in November where they like jumps over the table and tries to cut the guy's head off. But the common way to rebuke if this happens, or to be rid of them, or otherwise exercise them, should you no longer have use for them, or if they turn on you, is to give them an impossible task. Again, seen the movie, where they instruct the Krat to build a ladder out of bread. At which point, the spirit will become very confused and very dramatically light on fire and fly away. In a lot of folk astronomies of the area, this is certain types of comets and meteors are said to be Krats that have been dismissed.
Yeah, also I think it's worth noting that in the movie they like kind of explode. Like it's very mechanistic. Like they have them made out of not just sticks but farming equipment, rakes, scythes, and so on. And then you have it can kind of like a robot almost like get really confused and self-destruct, which has to do with the idea that this is a created spirit. You buy the soul from the devil and put it into this physical implement that is then going to become animated like a mannequin that will then do things for you. But the category of Shrat is so broad. The term is applied to so many different kinds of things, from gnomes and serpents and so on, as well as these created spirits that are bartered for their soul from the devil to help people with farm labor and with fertility and with gaining goods and so on. I love it. A case of a term becoming widely used to describe a broad variety of phenomena, the way that we might think of like the term fairy or aerial spirit or various things becoming very broadly used in many different cultures and sometimes used cross-culturally to interesting effects. Salt, I was thinking about you explaining to me a few times how, let's say, like a celestial fox, or in China might at times be referred to the literal translation to English being a fox fairy. And it's one of those things that, like, my head as a Balkan person is when I hear the word fairy, I think of Vila or Samavila, Samadiva, and so on. And I go like, whoa, really? And then of course someone who's raised in English cunning craft and someone's brought up in that tradition is going to think of something very different. But I like the idea that like, well, a 9-tailed fox is a fairy, like, I mean, well, it depends on how you use a term, right? But like Shut is very similar that way. It gets applied to so many different things.
It's more like a broad categorization with many different subcategories and stuff, right? Like it's always fun when you run into words with such a vast potentiality of meaning.
Right. Like the thing with Shra, it's like kind of the way that I would directly translate it would just be like magical being or like nature spirit. So, it gets really off, the rails of what one person saying, "Oh, I saw a shot today," could mean to another person, be it that I'm sure someone out there would be like, "Oh, I saw a fox with many tails, must have been a shot."
It's kind of like the way some people use the term wight, like WIGHT.
Yeah, very
borrowing
similar.
from Norse mythology and Germanic mythology and so on. You get like land wight, for example, being something that a lot of people across traditions use, or even in English, a lot of witches, that no matter, or sorcerers, no matter what the tradition is, will use fetch as a term, like fetch mate, or to describe a part of their soul that ventures out at night, or perhaps a familiar spirit that they, borrow the eyes and wings and claws of to pilot around, or an intimate familiar, or a lover or something like that. Like that's not a term that I use personally in my practice, but I see it a lot in books, and it's become more popularized and more global to say like, oh, this is my fetch mate, this is my fetch. When I leave my body and become a serpent, that's my fetch. But that may not be the initial term that you might use.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And like speaking of kind of the same deal with white, like kind of kobold enters English in the same way, which of course is talking about 50 different types of things, but to get into the stick category, another name for the kobold that lives within the mandrake root, as we kind of discussed earlier, the Auraune in German, can be the Schrat in some regions.
My favorite term from just looking into Aurona sorceries in Germany is Guildmenschen. I mentioned that in the beginning of the episode, but like the gold little man, just the idea that I was looking into treasure hunters because it's that great book, a very famous book by Johannes Dillinger, Magical Treasure Hunting in Europe and North America, that has an excellent chapter, a couple of chapters on some of the Germanic stuff that includes the magical treasure and its guardians, as well as the treasure hunter's magic. And he talks a little bit about the Guildmenschen, including ways that you might grow it as a mandrake, ways that it might become animated. Interestingly, ways in which it's said to grow out of the sperm shed by criminals when they were hanged at the gallows, very popular mandrake thing, as well as when ways in which they can be tricked out of other people's ownership when you can adopt them, steal them, and so on. And I found that quite fascinating. But I just like the idea that it's like a little guy who gets gold for you and who brings you wealth.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I in some ways love like the entire industry that arose around these fetishes that would then just be traded on like the open market.
Yeah, and traded, but also like people would then gain prestige by claiming to be able to sell them. There was this one moment in the book where Dillinger mentions that there was a group of treasure hunters from Göppingen in Württemberg that faced charges because they tried to buy a Guildmenschen from a wizard working as a herdsman, and also from some other shady character. Apparently, that's what he calls like a shady character from Nuremberg. It's supposed to help them find treasure, but the herdsman tricked them into spending 50 florins on a Guildmenschen that was actually a large bug dressed in colorful rags. It was not a mandrake root or any other kind of root that sometimes it gets made into Alrons. I just thought that was so funny. It's like it's just a little guy and it's like a big bug, dressed in lots of different colorful clothes. Yeah.
This is a bit of an aside, but I really appreciate that they mentioned that they were using florins as like the currency for this treasure hunting exchange, because this is so fucking nerdy, but like the florin was the main currency of the treasure hunters, because a lot of the treasure hunting magic that was used and also the treasure hunters themselves were originally from Florence.
That's really cool.
So
also,
there's
I love when you nerd out, so please keep going.
Yeah, there's a really interesting account from various like regional priests who would say in their kind of diaries or writings or like edicts against trafficking with these men, even because they would commonly show up into like a village and be like, I am a Florentine, or like a man from Florence who has learned magic at such and such academy or in whoever's house, of course, going to like necromancy in the Medici library and stuff like that. But then getting into squabbles or running grifts with the local people in the area, or if they were a magician, and there are a lot of accounts of this happening, they would ask the people, it's like, oh, where's your most, fertile mine for gold or silver or pewter or things like this, and then just rob the mine and leave. And then do a bunch of like juju to the mine, like Key to Necromancy Volume 2 by from Anodia Press has like an entire couple chapters devoted to like, okay, here's how you run the grift on the mine. And I absolutely love it. But there's this whole cross transnational treasure trade between Florence and parts of southern Germany that will eventually become a presentation.
Oh, hell yeah.
Somewhere. Yeah, some cool stuff. So to speak of treasure hunters and their magic, especially in Germany, let's talk about snakes. Let's talk about the Schrat becoming the Drac, and that itself becoming a complicated figure, again linked to dwarfs, kobolds, the people of the mines, and retaining the Schrat associations in this way. but also becoming the devil himself, who ruled over the mines in the area, because of course, laboring in the mines is hell, and becomes the Drache, drakes, worms, dragons that hoard and guard the treasure at the bottom of these mine shafts and the caves and alcoves and hearths, as was mentioned, of the various villages in the area. So before handing it over to Svinga, the figure of the Drak is frequently mentioned to take on additional animal forms beyond just snakes that are often associated with the witchcraft in the region. Notably cats, chickens, dragon chickens, partridges, hawks, owls, shoutouts, magpies, jackdaws, and then kind of more interesting, well, not more interesting, but just kind of more out there things. Three-legged hares, bright red snakes, pitch black ants, and crickets, all of which were said to be accompanied by a fiery aura or some sort of will-o'-wisp-like phenomena, to the point that these spirits are pretty tricky and dangerous to work with because they can just cause things in the room as they manifest to spontaneously combust. So in owning one of these Schrat, something really important to note, the owner also becomes a Schrat in the parlance, in the context of a witch, because the most common way to gain the possession of one of these spirits is to enter a compact with the devil. You know, as we discussed with the figure of the Krat, you're putting 3 drops of blood in the black book. And this will often come with prohibitions on going to church, like you can't witness masses and you can't receive communion.
I love a good dragon, good serpent related mythology. I think it's interesting to note that in a lot of different languages, this isn't universal, but in a lot of various European languages, when it comes to addressing serpent spirits, you'd use the term snake to refer to an animal, like the actual snake that you might find in various species in your land, or to denigrate a spirit, to say that, you are but a snake, you are not a serpent. A serpent involves some kind of holiness or spiritual power. Interestingly, where I'm from, there's the word smia is used for both. It's snake and serpent, but you would use tsirev, which is worm, to denigrate a spirit. So when you're shaming a dragon or a serpent and trying to subjugate it, you would call it worm. You even point to it and just say, like, you would hiss and so on and just be like, this is a worm, to get it to obey you, which of course WYRM is its own thing, so it's a whole other situation. So I would consider the Drak a kind of serpent, not necessarily like a celestial serpent or a holy serpent in that sense, but or a stellar one, but certainly a kind of serpent, because it's a spirit that is a familiar, that is a house spirit that brings all kinds of wealth to people. I think we could do a whole episode on Drak and Drache and different kinds of spirits, because it's worth noting they're not solely, as you mentioned, dragons or serpents. They come in many different forms. And there's Johannes Dillinger does mention them briefly in Magical Treasure Hunting in Europe and North America. He, in fact, goes over this particular quote where he discusses how the 17th century lawyer and demonologist Melchior Goldast, which, by the way, coolest name ever for a demonologist. He sounds like an NPC in like Diablo 2 or something. Like I love it. But yeah, so Melchior Goldast was very familiar with the belief in the Drache, and he says this.
The common man usually says that people who have become rich swiftly without any problems have a Drache, or as the Saxons say, a kobold or brownie.
So interesting to hear, note, right, is that the Drache, which is a word in German that means dragon, is associated with the kobold or the brownie. And Goldast actually regards dragons and brownies as alike because they're both demons. This is much as with many house spirit lore, is used as a way to describe why some householders do better than others. In Portugal and Spain and Iberia, owning the Book of Saint Cyprian was an excuse to say, like, this is why that person is doing better than us, because they have a Livre de Saint Cyprien, or that person is a werewolf. Same thing in the Balkans, same thing in Germany. Everywhere you get to see the story of whenever you notice some household in your village is doing better, it's like because they have some kind of secret weapon, a grimoire, a pact with a spirit, a particularly loyal familiar, or some kind of witchcraft or shape-shifting ability. So the Drache becomes a vehicle to explain why someone's doing better than others. They bring money to their owner. They often appear in the form of a serpent, but can also be a bird, a cat, can even be a little human being, like a little gnome or brownie. can be a stream of fire, like a meteor going through the night sky, a very typical serpent omen, right? Because it has that long fiery tail associated with many kinds of dragons around the world. And it steals money or grain, flies to the person in whose house it lives, and deposits it, So we have sources from the early 18th century that quote spells against magical theft by the Drache, so a way to ward against your property being stolen by someone else's serpent. And they are rewarded with food. And if you end up in a situation in which the owner of the spirit, being yourself, for example, fails to reward the familiar, it will burn down the house because it has a fiery nature. So in terms of elements, it's always associated with fire. Now, many scholars have noted that the actual connection between medieval European understandings of dragons and the Drache are superficial and tenuous. These are not typically depicted as lizards with leathery wings, but, to be fair, coming from the Balkans, neither are necessarily many dragons of ours. They're often very serpentine. Interestingly, Dillinger notes that the Drache is not like Fafnir, Beowulf's dragon. He does not have a treasure of his own. He is the embodiment of transfer magic, taking goods and stealing it from other people. And he of course links them to the Zmi, the Plon of Poland and Lusatia, the Aitavaras of the Baltics, the Liderk. And for me, of course, immediately in Serbia and Montenegro, you have the Zmija Čuvarkuća, which the term literally means the house guardian serpent. That lives in your hearth and steals other people's fertility and wealth and sucks the milk out of their cows and puts them into your cows and so on and so forth. And many different kinds of things can be referred to as drak. There's actually some really cool subspecies of them, if you will. There's different ways of getting them. So placing a dying person, for example, on a dunghill or placing dung under the dying person's pillow is a way to help a person who owns a drak to ease, because they say that drak tries to keep you alive so you could keep working with it and feeding it, right? On the other hand, people who it said that a drak's owner is not allowed to pray or go to church for communion, and that every third owner that a drak has, because it's passed down through the family line or can be stolen from other people, just like the drak steals things for you, it itself can be stolen, and much like the mannequin or the mandrik, the Auron, you want to keep that power for yourself, but every third owner the drak will send to hell, which I find quite interesting. But there's many different kinds of subspecies of draks. There's one that's the Korndrache, the Weizendrache, the Geldrieddrache. So this is like a grain dragon, wheat dragon, crop dragon. Sometimes also known as the Rogenketze, so that the rye cat brings cereals and rye and meats, can transport grain and eggshells or nutshells. Sometimes it carries too much, so it has to throw some away while it's flying, which then causes the seeds to germinate and populate other areas, which I find kind of fun. And also appears as a wet or freezing chicken, which is kind of sad. But then you show it gratitude by letting it live in your fireplace, which is why it will keep bringing things to you. There's also the Butterdrache, the butter dragon, or the Milchdrache, the milk dragon, which these bring milk or dairy goods, and the milk can look like cherry stones, interestingly. And they will even bring all the ingredients you need to bake a cake. And this is a typical thing. I mentioned before, Zmija does the same thing. They suck the milk out of cows dry until they only give blood instead of milk. And sometimes it will sit in the shape of a squirrel on a cow, waiting while the cow gets milk, which I found kind of interesting. And of course, it's not actually easy for it to steal butter, because it has to visit many different villages to get just a spoonful. So it'll get like a little bit from each village, which I found kind of interesting. There's also the Wurstdrache, which is a sausage dragon.
I love the Wurstdrache. I'm just imagining a big snake eating like a whole roll of sausage links, just like up the chain,
Yeah, and then becoming sausage.
Very good.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And of course, you offer it milk and chunks of bread roll for its services, and it brings you back meats and ingredients you need to make chicken soup. And sometimes it comes as a black dog, in which case it vomits milk or dumplings. It can even defecate knödel, which is the noodle dish. And they're wonderful. There's also the Knüffelkröte, that's the toad, the Knüffel toad, which also likewise defecates knödel. And then the drak itself becomes milk through a thread. which I find really fascinating. So these are very versatile spirits. They of course, serpents can technically in most mythologies become any spirit. They can take any form that they wish, because there are so many different kinds of powerful shapeshifters, right, that fall under the category of serpents, including stars themselves. But there is a differentiation between the gute Drache, so that's the good dragons, and the arme Drache, the poor dragons. The former will enter chimneys as a fireball and pour out milk, eggs, money, just shoot them out of its cute little belly, very much like the Smiacha Vrkucha. And the latter will appear as a intense, loud noise that will enter through windows and will leave behind a bad stench. And these are the ones that you want to exercise. So there's plenty of lore about how to drive them away. If you feel like you don't want them in your house anymore, if they're not benefiting you, if you don't want them to take you to hell. But interestingly, I would say that it is a household spirit. It does qualify under that particular category. Not much overlap with German kinds of dragon mythologies like Fafnir, for example, as we mentioned before, but definitely coming from a long line of house spirits that are also imagined as serpents. So for me, it's not so, even when I read German sources that are kind of like perplexed as to why are they referred to as dragons and serpents when they often don't even take those shapes. To me, it makes sense because the ancestor, if you will, the originator of a lot of the house serpent mythologies where I'm from are serpents, house serpents, that later on adopt certain characteristics, like looking like a little gnome man with a beard, or like a little grandpa, or having other kinds of characteristics, or becoming a chicken, or becoming a basilisk, becoming a toad, these kinds of things that get seated on the different parts of the household. But the origin is definitely a serpent. So to me, like, this makes a lot of sense. The why a shape-shifting being that can cultivate fertility and money, but also give you some trouble, would show up as one of these integral shapes.
Yeah, huge TY for going through all that just off the top. Very, very, very cool stuff. And it just makes me think a lot about the kind of how the serpents can introgress themselves into the mythology. So like, of course, very famously with like the Black Poulet and things like this, or mythology surrounding the keeping or breeding of these like demon-ridden chickens. They will produce an egg that will hatch a serpent and become the familiar.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned at the beginning as well this many different animal forms that it can take, as well as the will-o'-the-wisp phenomena, because these are such essential fiery beings. They can be shooting stars, meteorites, much like many other kinds of dragon spirits, lightning flashes, objects with fiery tails, including brooms, as we mentioned once. One of the arme Drache, the poor dragons, can show up as brooms, as glowing balls, as stars, ball lightning, fiery lumps of coal, a fiery grain sack, as well as being surrounded by blue firelight. And you get some of the names associated with Drache to be like this, Herbrand, shooting star, Langschwanz, long tail, Kurzschwanz, which is short tail, Schlitztet, which is like entwining tail, Glüstet or Glühschwanz, glowing tail, and of course, last but certainly not least, Salamander, after the fiery spirits themselves. And being accompanied by this kind of foul sulfur stench links them to the underworld for sure, but it also links them to all manner of associations with coal, with transcending different worlds, with leaving parts of themselves behind, and this kind of mobile luck, catching the will-o'-the-wisp, the shooting star, that can be very fickle and want to be fed, and the fire needs to keep going, so they want to keep you alive to make sure that you keep doing. Kind of like the opposite in our first episode, where we talked about the toad-bone ritual and people who wanted to get rid of it so they could finally sleep again and have a normal life. And then you cut to here, and you have people where the Drache keeps them alive, and they just want to pass on finally. So they're even doing this whole dung heap ritual just to be able to kind of move on and let the Drache be disgusted with the smell and move away, so that it doesn't keep you alive too long past your dues in order to keep feeding it.
Yeah, it's a really, really cool, comparative thing where it's like, I imagine the spirit sometimes driven away being like, well, you asked for vitality. Why are you going through this song and dance? I just did my job.
Exactly. But that's just a little off the top of my head, looking over my notes from Dillinger's book, as well as some of the things that come up from various different Handwörterbuch des Deutschen Aberglaubens, which catalog a lot of different kinds of really awesome German folklore. But we'll include that in our show notes for the Patreon folks regarding the sources. But yeah, just some things that off the top of my head, I hope it helps out a little bit in contextualizing the Draka. But I leave this wonderful information back in your very capable hands now. I just got to nerd out about my dragons and my snakes.
Oh, absolutely. I would not deny you the chance.
Nor did I have the opportunity to press the elevator button.
That's true. It's very true. You know, going into the TTC, can't touch the button.
No, I pushed the elevator button. I talked about the dragons, but please continue.
So, just as a brief aside, one of the patrons for the Q&A asked me about the ball lightning story. I will tell it there.
Yes.
So to get back into it, this is where our menagerie of household spirits comes to an end, and we, as woodland dwelling specimens that we are, leave the house and go talk to plants. So in Germanic folklore, there is the common motif of kind of the wild man, the wilde Leute, wild people, which are often known as the Moosleute, or moss people. And that is what we will be talking about today because they're most closely linked to the Schrat. So as we see the Moosleute, we also find the regional variations of Waldleute, so literally forest people, or Holzleute, or like wooden people. Although in the Holzleute figure is a little more problematic for our umbrella of the Schrat today, because in some regions it is an entirely different type of woodland dwelling being than like the Waldleute or the Moosleute, where the Holzleute is like a more wood rose, or is oftentimes compared to the Leshy of kind of like Eastern European stuff, than the Moosleute, which are more dryad-like, I suppose, to use a more familiar term to English-speaking audiences. Notably for us, Schratlein, so like a diminutive female Schrat, I suppose, or Waldschrat, forest Schrat, are used for both of these types of spirits. Less so with the latter, as I just explained. Anyway, so these spirits were, of course, always here before this, I don't want to say like almost encroaching umbrella of Schrat came about. They were, of course, here long before we were chilling in the forest. As we'll see later, they're really super old and attest as such in the mythology. But this naming convention shift happened because of a really metal mistake that I just wanted to bring up in a translation that the linguists G.H. Balg and Hinesley Wedgwood identified in a translation out of the Greek of the New Testament for like the Germanic Christianization, where daimonion was meant to become skosel, which is an archaic form of like demon or devil or imp, I suppose, but was corrupted variously to skolgur or skegla, meaning forest. So, of course, we find demon being forest, which real, but that's for another episode. Yeah, it's very sexy, and I couldn't pass it up. Mm-hmm. I'm like, oh yes, the hang upside down from trees type of guy I am.
Oh, very much so. You are definitely the wilde man yourself.
So to get right into it, the first guy who I kind of encountered who gave a good discussion of these figures was Alfred Meiche in his Sagenbuch des Königreichs Sachsen, so the, I guess, popular sayings book of the Saxon kingdom, describes Holzweibchen, or little wood woman, also called in from the same proto-ethnographic sources as the Buschweibchen, or little shrubwoman. I guess to borrow a term from the first episode we did on the Toadman, what was it? Oral history?
Yeah, it was oral histories.
So the Holzweibchen or Buschweibchen or Schrat appeared as a small, shriveled old woman with a wrinkly face, carrying wood in a basket on her back or brushwood in her apron, walking around propped on a walking stick. We love a forked stick, or a cane. Or sometimes she would be seen sitting in a shrub, spinning yarn or knitting at a crossroads. From, of course, Grimm, shoutouts to Grimm, drawing on him constantly this episode, we get descriptions of more child-sized beings as follows.
Grey and old-looking, airy and clad in green moss, round and round were found in the heath or in the woods at dark places, also in subterranean holes, dwelling and lying on green moss.
So with these spirits, interactions between them and humans ranged from wholly benefic, kind of blessed encounters to entirely malefic, generational curse-inducing, traumatic fairy abductions of different people. So the more common interactions were like net neutrally good, with the occasional borrowing of items or tools from humans by the spirits, specifically farming implements, that would cause these tools to go missing, which of course is very annoying and problematic for a 15th century German household that needs to be like subsistence farming. But they would invariably be returned with generous compensation in the form of pieces of advice, such as, oh, spread manure on your field on this day, or on this day there's going to be a hailstorm, so talk to the shamans to prevent that from happening, or do such and such to your livestock with this blessing and they will be more fertile this year, things along these lines. Or they would be given with loaves of very high quality bread. There's actually a lot of legends about these particular moss people. When the mountains in these alpine regions become smoky in the early mornings or in the late evenings, especially in like the spring and autumn, it was said that it was the Moosleute baking, or other figures who rule over the Moosleutes we'll get into in a bit. And in rare cases, going back to our Schratmann, the Moosleute that helped out this family, if they were, good and virtuous, would agree to become a domestic spirit. So this is another class of the gnome-like Schrat that can aid a household on a more permanent basis. The Holzfräulein, a little wooden woman, would be a bit more malefic, neutrally, where she had the capability of sending plagues. As we discussed in the Hagstrom episode, there were like the Schratsteine, and they had the capability of using these tools to shoot arrows that carried diseases and plagues and send bad winds and curse and do all these malefica that would usually permutate as plagues, as diseases that were spread throughout the countryside. But using these same tools, these Schratsteine, they could cure the victims of the diseases that they caused, sometimes dispensing really highly valued and treasured herbal and medicinal knowledge alongside it to this purpose. The most commonly documented herbal lore transmissions specifically have to do with the secret uses of dill seeds and the four-leaf clover, which is kind of
hell
great.
Yeah.
Love me some dill seeds. Love me some four-leaf clovers. I think in some of the anti-plague vinegars, and I think salt, correct me on this, but dill seed is sometimes incorporated in the recipes, especially in the case of preservatives. But
Yeah.
in rare cases, though, she would gift the Springgras, which is a mythical or pseudo-mythical plant. As we know, these are sometimes a bit more real at Svinga.
Raskovic is real. I don't care if Wikipedia says an alleged plant that is mythological. It's real, and I've seen one. A hedgehog led my grandfather to it. Okay, it's real.
Hell yeah. So the Springgras is a mythical, quote-unquote, plant said to be shaped like a heart with a drop of gold or blood dropping from it. So I kind of conceptualize this as looking like the bleeding heart, just a bit more glowing and on fire, that is said to grow in the mountains in spots where people had been murdered, which of course ties us back to the mannequin growing notably under the gallows and soaking up either the blood or sexual fluids of these victims. The person who receives the plant in this way has to cut open the palm of their left hand and allow the plant to grow into it, which, very, very witchcraft.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. So having secured the Springgras in this way, the owner gains the power permanently to soundlessly burst or break iron with just a touch from that hand. Particularly noted in cases of opening fetters, binds, shackles, locks, chains, anything that would impede them made of metal. One of the interesting things, though, about the herbal lore, after especially like the dill seeds, moss people are said to just fucking hate caraway. For whatever reason, they're appalled by its presence. Evidenced by what is said to be one of the most common utterances of the Hostfräulein, which is "Kummelbrot unser Tod," or quite literally, "Caraway bread, that is our death."
Ah.
I'm not 100% sure why this is. Like, I have guesses, but it's kind of varies widely and is largely lost time. So encounter one of these spirits and ask them about it.
Totally.
Another thing about this myth, really interestingly, is that the wood or moss people in kind of their more dryad-like guises are said to sometimes marry humans. And this is documented as early as the 6th century in sources that were kind of aggregated by Grimm and are more extensively accounted for by 11th century clergy. This process was a little sketchy sometimes, especially when it was like male woodsmen taking human lovers, where they would be more of like abduction narratives that produce changelings out of this that are again taken away by the forest people upon their birth. But very cool that we see another spirit marriage popping up.
Totally.
Frequently, and to me, very interestingly, Moosleute are said to be the object or like the quarry of different wild hunts that exist in this region, which informs a lot of the societies that they build in the spirit world. And one of my favorite things about these spirits is that the folklore surrounding their kingdoms and societies and the hierarchies of how they live their lives is really well documented. And there are like highly preserved motifs that the males and females of the species live separated from the times of their children and enter into marriages among themselves, at which point they can move into hollow trees and form little households. And sometimes you see the tents that they live in before they form households in the woods that are like overhanging curtains of moss in very particularly arranged ways. Cool stuff. But sadly for them, there is like a pseudo genocide myth that they will bring up in interactions with humans. And we see what is going on from Grimm.
Between Leithicken and Dauernheim, in the Wetterau stands the high mountain, and on it a stone, der Welle Fragestol, the wild woman's chair. There is an impression on the rock, as of the limbs of human sitters. The people say the wild folk lived there, by die Shan noch Melwan, while the stones were still soft. Afterwards, being persecuted, the man ran away. The wife and child remained in custody at Dauernheim until they died.
To further elaborate, this is a quote of the persecution.
With regards to the giant mountains in Silesia, the local wild huntsman, known simply as Nachtjäger or night hunter, chases the so-called Rüttewiebe, the shaking women, which are thought of as little women clad in moss. Their only chance at rest is the trunk of a felled tree, to which the woodsman did say, Gott wills, God may prevail, in Silesian dialect. Should he have said Wales Gott when putting the axe at a tree, though, putting God at the end, then such a trunk offers no rest to a Rüttelweibchen who has constantly to flee the Nachtjäger.
Yeah, it's interesting here to contrast this kind of with the disappearing fairy myths you might find in like northern Scotland or Manx folklore, I think it is as well. I think I may have seen it in Jersey or the Channel Islands as well at one point, where the fairies essentially are kind of disappearing, and it's kind of like an explanation for the growing influence of secular beliefs or like detachment from prior generations and their folk beliefs, or maybe even just we don't see the fairies anymore, kind of like an explanatory gloss for that in mythological storytelling terms. But here obviously the character is a bit more violent, but it's still very much, yeah, I find a story really interesting in how it just kind of shows like how folklore adapts to modern ways, modern changes, and so on. Just, I love it.
And just to go off of like adapting the folklore to modernity, as I was reading this, I was trying to look into what these woodsmen were doing as they were doing like the Gott Wales or Wales Gott, in the Silesian German that, thanks Sminka for getting us through that one, because that is a dialect I do not speak. But as they moved through the forest and demarcated what trees they would chop down and what wood they would take, it was common practice in the area to mark the trees that would be felled with crosses, with their axes, like put two chops into it. And it is specifically in these doomed trees that the Rutovivre could take their refuge. And I almost was thinking about this in like, I don't know, like proto ecological way almost, about like not chopping down the trees, because it's like, oh, the doomed trees is now the home of a particular spirit that if you are to take this tree, that spirit will be dispossessed and hunted once again.
Mhm.
So yeah, I thought it was kind of cool.
Totally, yeah. Lots of similar traditions around the world regarding taboos on felling certain trees, including ones that are marked as particular homes for certain spirits. Interesting that it was a common practice, as you said, to mark a tree that was to be felled with a cross. Very different from Serbia, where, you know, Azapis, the inscription, the tree, the holy tree that has a cross carved into it, is the one that you cannot touch, that you're not meant to even pick up branches or leaves that organically fell to the earth, that were not moved in any way by human hands. It's not owned by anybody but itself, including if it's on someone's property. It owns itself. It has its own agency, and you're not meant to touch it. But here, the cross demarcates that it will be felled, which makes it the doomed tree where the Rutoveber might end up sleeping under.
Yeah, super cool.
But regarding Rutoveber, is this where we get our Bush Grossmutter, the rainbow?
Yes. So a motif among these moss people is that, as mentioned earlier, their society is often segregated between males and females throughout the region from childhood until they marry. And the female moss people cohort is ruled by a queen that is called the Buch Großmutter. Excuse me, Bush Großmutter.
Not the book lake, right? Yeah.
The Bush grandmother.
Well, she'll show you a thick bush.
so oh man, that's so the Bush Großmutter, as described by the folklorist Ludwig Bernstein, goes as follows.
According to certain tales of the peasantry, a demonic creature dwells near Wittenberg and on the left bank of the River Saale, called the Buschgroßmutter, shrub grandmother. She has many daughters, called Moosfräuleins, moss ladies, with whom she roves around the country at certain times and upon certain holy nights. It is not good to meet her, for she has wild, staring eyes and crazy, unkempt hair. Often she drives around in a little cart or wagon, and at such times it is wise to stay out of her way. Children, in particular, are afraid of this putzmummel, hooded female boogie, and delight in whispering tales of her to frighten each other.
In this account, there's a couple interesting things going on to me that I just want to flag before going on, which is that it's the Bush Großmutter that is said to have the children, not the Bush Mutter, or like the Bush Mother, which is a figure that people don't even discuss out loud, because of how deeply guarded her mysteries are and how terrifying she is to even be invoked, which is very interesting. And also the driving around of this like little cart or wagon, it reminds me of a lot of other pre-Christian Germanic goddesses, specifically like earth and soil goddesses, who are said to like drive these carts, most notably like Nerthus and her holy procession that is centered around the cart itself. Which, you know, I just kind of wondering how much of a reflex that is, and the scholarship is still out, but it's interesting to kind of think about the relationship between those spirits. So as discussed with her, more familiar to the pan-European mythologies of like these spooker, more familiar to the pan-European mythology.
I'm not editing that out. That's good. Spooker. It's the book grandma and the spookers.
Yeah, I'm falling apart. I need some more coffee over here or something.
Yeah,
I need to stop being ridden by the Buch and Bush Großmutter. The Buch Großmutter with ihre ganze Bush.
Do you want to take a sec to grab a drink? I don't mind.
It's all good. So more familiar to the pan-European mythology of like a spooky grandmother, or you know, the famously the Baba type spirit. We have the account of the folklorist Hans Nauermann, who, just to flag, is better remembered as the massive piece of shit that he was later in life. Like, he organized a lot of book burnings in Nazi Germany. Horrible guy, but unfortunately wrote the very definitive text of oral history about a lot of these woodland spirits in the Bush Großmutter. But to get into it, he did extensively document the accounts of the forest people, and some of the most interesting which are as follows.
The Bush Großmutter is as old as the hills, her appearance being small and docked wrinkly and ugly. She has staring eyes and is sometimes said to have an iron head, a typical demonic feature. Her hair is long as white as snow, but messy and full of lice. Her feet are overgrown by moss and she walks in a wavering manner. She has tied her apron as if she were transporting something in it, and also carries a basket on her back. The character of the bush grossmutter is ambivalent, fluctuating between benevolent and malevolent behavior. She will ask people to comb or delouse her hair, and those who fulfill her request will be rewarded with a never-ending clue of yarn, with a spindle covered with 100 strands of yarn, which might vanish should the recipient curse in its presence. It is, however, very difficult to clean and tidy the bushwife's hair, because her head is as cold as ice, thus leading to a temporary freezing of the Emperor's hands.
I love here how, again, we see this motif of disappearing if you swear or curse or are impolite.
Very orderly and very German.
But also, she herself is very wild and unkempt, and it reminds me of various spirits that might come around, and certainly fairies that might ask you to comb their hair. This is a way for them to have power over you. Or we get the Truma, the disease spirit in various parts of the Balkans, who wanders around and might ask for some kind of product to clean her hair with, or some kind of shoes or candy. And if you deny it, she curses your family. But if you give it to her, she'll become like a benevolent aunt figure to you. As you get into stories of Bibi, or Sunta Bibi, the holy auntie, a saint aunt of the Vlach and Rom people of the Balkans, especially Serbia, who celebrate Bibi jako Divje, which is this kind of festival to the aunt, who is said to be Truma to the Gadje when they reject her, but is the helpful aunt to the Rom when she protects them and they let her in and share what little they have with her.
There's similar mentions of lying as well, and I guess we'd call it appropriate speech when you're in the presence of the pygmies and the gnomes in some of the Hohenschwang texts as well. It's really interesting to see how much it's emphasized in Germanic lore. I mean, obviously it's present in English folklore as well and everything like that, but it just seems a little bit more prominent here than most other places that I've encountered it.
Yeah, definitely. No matter the permutation of them, that is the one through line that we see with the Schrat. It's they don't like being, sworn around. A lot of time what is reiterated is, of course, the family who is keeping the Schrat in whatever form they are said to be good and virtuous. And of course, like Svinga is saying, it's the good and virtuous families who give what little they have to the Saint Aunt. Sorry, I'll butcher it. Baba
Oh, sorry, that's grandma aunt. Tetka is
grandma.
the Serbian word for aunt. Bibi is
Gotcha.
the Rom Vlach word for it. So it's Sunta Bibi is like Saint Bibi, or Sveta
Gotcha.
Tetka is holy aunt or saint aunt. Yeah.
Yeah, 2i.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for Saint Aunt, it's this goodness and virtuousness and the willing to give even a little bit as well. And the Shratala motif, it's they're giving even the cracklings and these little off cuts to the spirit, being here's what we got. Because of course, being Yiddish speaking Jewish populations in Alsace early on was not a great spot to be in life. Lots of persecution, but you're still willing to keep these spirits and are highly rewarded as a result and given very powerful allies, which I think is another cool motif of our particular Schrat. The goodness and virtuousness of the Bush Großmutter herself mayhaps does not extend as far, because we get to our next segment, which is tentatively titled "Who is your daddy and what does he do?" Or rather, "Who is your grandma and she do?"
But put your grandma on the phone.
Yeah. So we will discuss a method to literally put your grandma on the phone in a moment. For the first time in the podcast history, we'll finally have the grandma on the phone.
I love how this has become a recurring meme without any of us intending it to be. This was not a gag that we thought was going to keep coming back. But ever since episode 1, who is your grandma? Can you put her on the phone? And if at last finds its fruition in the Bush Großmutter.
Many folklorists over the years, most notably Lechtin, as we discussed earlier, have attempted to link the Bush Großmutter with figures from Germanic and Alpine pagan mythologies, specifically Frau Persta and Frau Hulda. And Bernstein really got into their shared attributions. I didn't ever really quite agree with his view as I first saw it, and then figured out that there was additional scholarship later on that now rejects his claim and identifies him as, really distinct figures in the mythologies out of which they arise. But I do want to bring up their shared office of a female leader of the wild hunt who even goes on this wild hunt on the same holy day, specifically, the Feast of the Epiphany, most commonly. And one of the main pacts, like the main animals in the lore and like sorcerer's practice that connects them, which is the cricket, as we discussed at the very outset. So, as was kind of best documented, in my opinion, by Leander Petzold.
A moose Bible traversing the forest at night, described as being hunchbacked and half blind, found 3 charcoal makers asleep in the forest. Their heads placed on a sack of moss, their feet stretched out in different directions. Feeling them, the moose Bible got the impression of having found a creature with 6 legs and a single head, the likes of which she had never seen before, despite being so old that she knew the Bohemian forest 9 times as pure forest and 9 times as consisting of both meadow and forest. So impressed she was that she hurried home to tell her grandmother, who said she was 9 times as old as herself.
So the Bushgroßmutter, the grandmother of the Moosweibel, of course knew this insect and identified it most likely as the Heimchen, or the house cricket, which itself is the attested form taken across permutations of the Schrat, be it the soul of a deceased person who has become somewhat vampiric in death due to an inappropriate administering of rites post-mortem or failure to receive baptism and perishing as an infant, a form of the soul of the Schrat in the figure of the witch, the dwarf-like mountain beings that we discussed at the outset of this episode, the Heimchen, or as hunters of various kinds, be it the Moosweibel and things like this in the procession of the wild hunt. Here is where the link to Perchtha actually gets kind of interesting, in my opinion, because Perchtha herself, one of her attested titles is the Heimchenkönigin, or the Queen of the Crickets. And it's in this context, the Heimchen, or the cricket, is thought of to be the soul of a deceased, usually unbaptized child that has come back into this world variously. And of course, as we discussed in the last episode and really nerded out about, these spirits more commonly are butterflies or moths, over which Perchtha is reigning. But it's said that there is a cricket, a Heimchen, that sits on her nose, endlessly calling and pipering, as it were, these spirits through the Alps on Epiphany night processions. So one of the other things in these processions that I just want to bring up as we kind of close out, the impact of like the Schrat on these areas and like the way that they deal with things is still around. Notably, in this particular Epiphany possession, there are whirlwinds that can occur in like very violent windstorms. And in kind of the south of Germany, these are still called Schrettel, from the Schrat for whirlwind. So that is Schrat. That is the Schrat
and incredibly comprehensive. You seamlessly weaved through so many different kinds of spirits that get folded under this umbrella. Absolutely wonderfully done. Not that I expected anything less from our resident polymath BK here. But yeah, I loved it. Thank you so much for teaching us all this stuff. And thank you for letting me have a chance to pop off with some dragon stuff too.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you guys for bearing with me as I went a little crazy reading all these sources and trying to ask the question, what the hell is a Schrat? And coming up with what does not even come close to an answer, but we're getting there.
If the answer takes 2 hours, as this has, then I think it's a pretty fucking good answer. Genuinely, yeah. Thank you so much, man. This has been really enjoyable, especially seeing like the distinctions and the similarities between German lore and elsewhere. Like it's been really enjoyable. So glad to have gotten the chance to listen in,
Hell yeah. So speaking of listening in, what is our Akashic record of today? My suggestion, after going off the rails and seeing so many people compare Kobold to Alp to Elf to Errol, of course being, the elder or the alder tree, depending on translation, I went with Franz Schubert's rendition of Der Erlkönig.
Amazing. My personal favorite edition of Erlkönig actually is from the Ghost Bees group, which their album Tassiomancy. They're hard to track down. They used to be on Spotify. Nowadays they're not, but they were a neo-Gothic folk duo coming out of Canada from Nova Scotia, I believe. But yeah, they're absolutely wonderful. Testamency was a 2008 album, and I just love their rendition of El König. By far my favorite, but I definitely love that one too. Mine are, okay, so the first one, I have two. The first is Kobold im Kopf by Versengold, which of course, I absolutely love that one. The album name is Was kost die Welt, and I believe it's just a little bit of millet porridge that you give to your drak to feed him and keep him happy, so he keeps bringing you gold. And I thought about this kind of last second as we were talking about this, but my other Akashic record is going to be Orange Evening, WIG and Lauten Louise. Just because the YouTube link to it, like when you look at the video, is classic Schratz to me. All manner of woodland spirits and all manner of things going on. That to me is quintessential Schratz. And I listen to that track pretty much on loop many days of the week.
Likewise, it's so good. We'll definitely have to link it in the show notes because it is top notch. And it looks like Salt has an Akashic record for us today as well. The first inaugural Salt Akashic record.
Well, that was requested in the Q&A, and it's time. So I think keeping with the region for today's episode, I'm going to say Camelot's albums. Yeah, 2 whole albums, not just 1, 2, and not just a song. 2 albums. Epica and The Black Halo by Camelot, because it is a power metal rock opera based on Faust. And how can you not love that? Like from Mephistopheles.
You introduced me. Yeah, you introduced me to them, and I was like pretty blown away by how good it is as like a musical rock opera about Faust and Mephistopheles. Absolutely phenomenal stuff. And yay, my love, you finally gave us an Akashic record. Someone in the Q&A was like, when are we going to find out Salt's epic music taste? And now you get a little hint. It involves rock operas.
I like lots of words.
I couldn't tell by your magical practice.
Oh man, that is really good. Segues us nicely, being power metal rock opera about Faust into today's License to Depart, which is an excerpt from Goethe's Faust in the original German. But before sending all of you off to the place from which you came, thank you so much, everyone, for listening in today. Make sure to, as always, check us out on our Patreon, patreon.com/The Frightful Howls, and on Twitter at twitter.com/Frightful Howls.
Twitter, or as it's called now, X.
Oh, goodness gracious.
I've never even opened a Twitter until we did the podcast, and now I'm like, oh my God. But yeah, we'll see what it will be in the future. But for now, that is indeed where you can find us. And thank you all so much for supporting us. We thank you especially to our patrons who keep the show running, who enable us to do even more bonus content, Salt's wonderful almanac, our plant lore of the month, our Q&As, ability to suggest episodes, and all manner of other goodies that are coming soon to you. Very excited to keep building on our Patreon community, and to you guys who make this possible and who let us keep putting these out at a regular pace. So thank you all so much. With that said, I'm going to hand it back off to Key. I know you've been talking the whole time, but we give it back to you one last time so you can give it to us in that wonderful velvety tone that lets us sit apart from Goethe's Faust.
Erst zu beginnen dem Tiere, brauch ich den Spruch der Viere. Salamander soll glühen, Undine sich winden, Sylphe verschwinden, Kobold sich mühen. Wer sie nicht kennte, die Elemente ihrer Kraft und Eigenschaft, wäre kein Meister über die Geister. Vielen Dank.